Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Hey, Todd, we're going to pick up from our episode number 85 that Rick Presley, you and I did, around personality disorders. We really did the deep dive into narcissism. Today, I want to talk about other personality disorders and really begin with borderline personality disorder. I know for me, I have a mother who now has passed, but she had a lot of markers in the borderline personality disorder kind of characteristics. And so I have a lot of familiarity around that and the struggles and difficulties, and we may kind of talk through that. But talk to us a little bit about the big picture. What is a personality disorder? What is it in contrast to a mood disorder? So I'll hand it off.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's great to be back, and such a pertinent topic. Yeah. I think what we're seeing, and what's curious to me about kind of long COVID is we tend to think of all the dimensions of COVID that impact the body, cardiovascular, pulmonary issues. What we're finding in the research is that the single greatest long-term impact from long COVID has to do with changes in personality.
Wow.
So it's little known. It's all over the clinical research, but we're not talking about it in the news as much. It's not a super sexy title, right?
Wow.
Because there's not doom and gloom associated with that, but it's of clinical significance.
Yeah.
So I think for us, we've done the narcissism conversation. This research has emerged between episode 85 and today. So it's really interesting for me as a psychologist to be paying attention to, like, oh, wow, these characteristics. When we think about personality, these characteristics that we tend to see, they're long-standing, they're patterns that endure. All of our personality traits and characteristics tend to be long-standing after about the age of 11, right? Less malleability, so they're long-standing. We've been who we are for a long time. They persist, and they cut across most situations and circumstances that we find ourselves in. So think about, if you will, something like introversion or extroversion.
Yep.
Right. Some of us are more introverted, and we draw our energy from time in solitude, time alone. Some of us are more extroverted. Our batteries are recharged in community and time spent with other people. Some of us are kind of a blend. I know for me, my long-standing pattern is when I'm engaging another person, when I'm doing a lecture, like I come across as very interpersonal. I can talk a lot. Right? Like I can carry conversation. I enjoy being a faculty member, a professor, a lecturer, a therapist. And that's not where my batteries are charged. So a lot of people think I'm an extrovert unless they know me really well. And they're like, interesting. Like you do that part of you really well, but your personality trait is really one of introversion. You need that time in quiet, that time alone, taking long walks on dusty roads, right? Like where you might find me if you're out and about, just meandering the countryside. So revitalizes my heart and recharges my spirit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what I need to be able to really gear up for the next. So it's an example, introversion, extroversion, pretty historical trait we talk about, or characteristic we talk about with personality. And those long-standing, cutting across circumstances, right, like is how we think about personality characteristics. And there's a host we could get into, like agreeableness, like how well do you get along with others, conscientiousness, like what's your degree of morality or decision-making. Those are from famous models, like a Big Five model, if you will, 5-factor personality model that some people might have heard of. When we're talking about DSM, and now we're on DSM-5.
And what is DSM-5?
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for mental disorders. We're really talking about a cluster of really atypical, is what I want to say. It doesn't mean that they're not common, because we can carry traits, we can carry reflections of environments that we've been raised in, some markers, if you will. But we're talking about a cluster of variables that have an undue level of impact, either in how they change our interpersonal capacity for connecting, or they impair our kind of sense of self-identity. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
So we talked about narcissism. It's kind of about egocentricity and kind of scope of self-concept, right? Like I'm bigger than everything. My thoughts are better than everything. My way is going to be the best outcome for everything. Borderline, which is related, actually, it's in the same cluster of disorders in DSM-5, cluster B of personality disorders. So it's similar, it shares some features, but qualitatively different. Borderline is probably best defined as an incredible fear of being left or abandoned that creates an intensity of despair. And it trickles down into a couple of other facets. One would be identity diffusion, kind of a nerdy term, I know. I'll use my language for it. Think about a chameleon. Right? Like a chameleon is an interesting species. It's able to mask its appearance in its environment if it's there long enough.
Yeah.
Right. So identity diffusion is really just under the umbrella of borderline personality disorder, the ability to take on the likes, the characteristics, the attributes of someone that the individual's in relationship with, so as to avoid that potential for rejection.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be left or abandoned, so I take on the characteristics and traits of other people so as to not be left or abandoned in some way. Yeah. And imagine in that space the tension, right? Like, these aren't really my likes, these aren't really my preferences, I'm preferring things to not be left by this person that I admire, this person that I like. Inevitably, resentment is going to build.
Yeah.
Right? So there's kind of this push-pull with borderline of, like, I hate you, don't leave me is one of the common kind of colloquialisms that we use in the field, right? And I kind of keep doing my hands like this. It's this, like, I hate you, right? Like, there's this resentment that builds. I've done everything to feel like I'm desirable to you, that you're not going to go anywhere. But we've talked about diffusion a lot on this podcast and how naturally there needs to be boundaries and separation. Well, part of that identity diffusion or chameleoning effect is about being too close. And as people naturally in relationship diffuse, right? You see this a lot in marriage early on, right? Like, we just love each other so much and we like the same things. And so there's a natural space for that, right? The issue with this kind of identity diffusion or chameleoning effect in borderline personality disorder, it's not the trait, it's not the fact that exists, it's that it never changes. It's the exclusivity of that. It's just like narcissism, right? Like, we all kind of can bow up and flex and be like, no, wait a minute, like, I'm the head of a project, this is important, this needs to happen. That's different as a state of being than it is a trait, this long-standing pattern of behavior that cuts across circumstances. So as Mary Jo Peebles-Kliger talks about, who's just a notable physician, she used to be in Topeka, now she's on the East Coast, her quote is, the problem with all these personality disorder features, it's not the trait itself, it's the exclusivity, it's the fact that it's the only way of being that we get stuck in when it comes to personality disorders. And in the context of leadership, it's the thing we keep bumping into with that one personality. Yeah. Right? Like, we've been in meetings, board meetings, where, like, somebody has to take the reins, lead, be it a pastor, a board leader, right? Like, the problem is not those moments. The problem becomes, or it's revealed is probably better stated, the problem is revealed when it's the exclusivity of that way of being that person can only operate in all of their relationships. So imagine the difficulty, and you alluded to kind of your mom having some of these markers early on. Imagine the difficulty, and for you, I guess I would say reflect on the difficulty of these moments where there's this fear of abandonment, where someone has chameleoned their way into finding your love and value and acceptance, and then naturally in diffusion, right? Like, we're creating some boundaries, we're separating to maintain that balance. And then all of a sudden it's the I hate you, the don't leave me part is there, like, I'm going to be everything that you want me to be. But any subtle shift, right? And then there's the resentment all spills out. I do a lot of examples that I borrow from are from cinema, right? So in the film Fatal Attraction, right? If we're going to talk about borderline personality disorder, we have to talk about this hallmark presentation where Glenn Close's character gets really intensely connected to Michael Douglas's character, right? Just like all in, overboard, I would say smothering, no boundaries, and of course, have an affair, right? If people aren't familiar with don't go watch the movie. It's not an endorsement. We're just going to talk about it from a teaching perspective.
You don't want to watch it with your kids.
No, you don't want to watch it at all, actually. Just take my word for it, right? Like, I'll tell you about the story. Right, but there's this kind of like heat-seeking missile effect that we also see with borderline personality disorder. You're everything I've been looking for. I love you so much. Like, you complete me. Jerry Maguire's another one, right? Like, you complete me. Like, I hate that. Actually. Right? Not because it's not beautiful in the context of Christian marriage, but when it becomes an exclusive, like, I find that you're the solution to my emptiness, which is another feature of borderline personality disorder. But kind of that heat-seeking missile effect of, like, we are so intensely connected. This is the the best relationship I've ever had after 3 days.
Yeah, right. A Hallmark movie.
Right, yeah. And then all of a sudden, right, like over the natural course of time, again, like differentiation is important.
Yeah.
Those boundaries are important. And as people kind of settle into a relationship and that natural diffusion of energy happens,
Yeah.
that exclusivity of that borderline trait is, oh no, I'm being rejected. I can't be abandoned. If I force you out,
Yeah.
I protect myself from the pain of loss. I'm not abandoned. If I go crazy,
Yeah.
right, and break in your house and boil your bunny rabbit, part of the film, right? Sorry, spoiler alert, right? But like we see these like atypical intensifications of behavior that get really, really scary.
Yeah.
Or if they're not intrusive, right? I would say those are intrusive, right? Like violating someone's physical space, killing someone's bunny rabbit, right? Like
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
intrusive. Or you see kind of the other end of the continuum, which is a lot of desperation, a lot of suicidal gestures, a lot of don't leave me, I'm going to kill myself, and the use of threat of harm to self to maintain that proximity and relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which again, think about the sense of entrapment in that space for someone who, with a parent as a child, with a spouse or a boyfriend, girlfriend, a partner, right? There's a lot of emotional intensity that holds the relationship together, and it's just unsustainable. Like it can't last.
Yeah. Yeah. Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and I am a husband, father, pastor of 35 years, and a strategic therapeutic mentor to leaders in all arenas of life. I am an inerrantist, a Calvinist Arminian betweenist, a Holy Spirit continuist, and a finished work of Christ redemptionist. Red Ink Revival was designed to create a revival in the heart, soul, and brains of Christian leaders from all spheres of influence. Our team of pastors, psychologists, and therapists facilitate our life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. Our goal is to bring a revival, an integrated wholeness to pastors, church staff, the local church, and the universal Big C church around the world. This includes marketplace leaders, educators, foster adoptive parents, and so much more. If this podcast is providing value to you, would you consider subscribing to it wherever you get your podcast? Also, please like the episodes, comment on them, and share them on your social media feeds. And one more big favor. If you like the show, please go review it at Apple. And if it's true of you, give us 5 stars. Now let's go back to this week's episode. When I think about personality disorders, I'm curious, is a personality disorder primarily interpersonal in the way that it functions? So it's not just how I experience myself in my individuation. It's not just that I'm somewhere and driving by myself and having all of these emotional experiences, but it's so catalyzed by the interpersonal component. Would that be true of personality disorders?
Yeah, I would say it's both and, right? Like it's the interpersonal component in the developmental process.
Okay.
So a lot of, there's a famous paper that was published 2012, 13, somewhere in there. You got to forgive me for losing track of the date. That showed the best predictor of borderline personality disorder is actually emotional, neglectful environments as a kid.
So trauma is going to play a big factor.
It can, it can. So it's not like just because someone's experienced trauma, but if there's trauma tends to activate whatever's already there. Mm-hmm. So imagine a neglectful environment where there's not a lot of formation, where there is a legitimate sense of fear of abandonment.
Yep.
And then trauma happens for a certain percentage of people, that later trauma is going to catalyze and almost concretize that style.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think in some ways, actually on a neurophysiological level, the nature of neglect is such that it leaves the child as, in their mind, as the exclusive explanatory variable. Mm-hmm. Mom doesn't respond to me, dad doesn't respond to me, my siblings don't care about me, I feel invisible, and teachers like, it must be me. Whereas acute trauma response is about like, whoa, this bad thing happened to me, and if I can avoid that person, if I can stay away from that space, if I have these boundaries, like I can protect myself. So we actually have better neural structure, like God designed us to respond natively to trauma, like acute traumatic moments, single one-off trauma moments.
Yep.
But when we're immersed in an environment over time, that is maybe a lower threshold for inappropriate. Right? I think about, not sure if there's going to be food on the table, don't have clean clothes to wear to school, nobody ever teaches me about my body, there's never celebration of my accomplishments or my life on my birthday, right? Like, these spaces that most of us are like, oh my gosh, like, of course we do that. Like, of course we go out and celebrate you on your birthday. Of course we're going to make sure you have clean clothes to wear, your shoes aren't going to have holes in them, right? We're going to equip you academically and spiritually. Like, we just give kids what they need to grow into healthy people.
Yeah.
When that's withheld, though, and there's this inescapability, right? Like, that's what shapes, I would kind of a nerdy term, but like how I think about personality disorders, right? It's characterological dysfunction. So it might not be diagnosable, but some of these markers that you're talking about, it's really dysfunction in their characterological makeup, these personality traits broadly, that start to go askew in one's development.
Yeah.
So trauma is important, but neglect is really the fertile soil out of which we're going to see dysfunctional personality traits
and
arise.
Neglect is a way that trauma
I would say little t,
happens.
and I think we've talked about this way on back, right? Little t versus big T trauma, right? Like big T trauma are those big intrusive violations, an assault, a home break-in, a car accident, surviving a tornado or an earthquake, right? Big T traumas. Right, versus the little t, right? Like the constancy of, it's kind of like, I think of Chinese water torture, right? Like it's the drip. The constancy of that drip and the inescapability of the environment is really, truly torturous. And it has a lasting impact. I would say a more lasting impact, by and large, per this paper that I'm talking about.
So everyone, I'm curious, everyone that presents a personality disorder, and of course we're talking specifically at this point on borderline personality disorder, but everyone, are you saying that everyone that presents the quantifiable cluster, so there, how many markers are there that present or justify the diagnoses? Because there's like 8 or 9, right? And then, well,
DSM, typically, it depends on the disorder, but you're going to get kind of an equation of like, if, 3 of these 9 or 5 of these 9 are met, or 5 of these 7 or 2 of these 8, just depends.
Throughout all of them, So are all of them, all personality disorders, connected to little t traumas, to big T traumas, or can you have some of these personality disorders just based on a genetic profile?
It's a fantastic question. Some of that is still being debated and discussed. So kind of for the clinicians who might be listening to us, the Section 3 of DSM-5 has this area, Section 3 is this area for future research, things that are being considered, and what we're seeing is the truncation of the 10 classic personality disorders down to 6. As I look at that, what's interesting to me is the ones that probably have more of a genetic potential, like schizotypal and schizoidal personality disorders, which is kind of the odd eccentric cluster, are more similar to like schizophrenia or schizophreniform disorders, and I would suggest like are being moved largely because they have more to do with biological dynamics that have been activated versus styles of being interpersonal styles that have been shaped and molded by way of environment. So obviously, right, like we are incarnational beings, we're material beings, like nature and nurture work together. So I'd have to go look for you to know, is there any like discrepancy between disorders with regard to which is loaded on more biologically, like predispositionally, versus what is kind of nature by way of nurture. What I mean by that is what is truly genetically there and waiting to be turned on versus what is environmentally created and then it shows up in our bodies.
My experience with clinicians and psychologists is that in private, sitting around tables, the expectation is that it's based in nurture. Even if there is the factor of genetics, that it generally is based in little t traumas or big T traumas, though the research, and this is what everyone says that I talk to, and again, I'm I'm an armchair quarterback.
Sure.
So the ones that I hear from say that they believe that it is relational injury, wounds, traumas, etc., that over time forge the personality, and this is the individual's reactivity towards survival and belonging. And but then you have the multiple markers that are in all of those that you might present a feature. I find that really interesting because what that is saying to me is that these personality disorders are fundamentally wrapped up in biochemistry, that there are different neurochemicals, there are neural pathways that evolve and develop, and so instincts form the way we mind map the people around us, how we begin to mind mask, how we begin to block, how we begin to do so many of the different interpersonal things we do. And so for me, I find that very interesting because partly what it does for me, whether a person is diagnosable or as a pastor and a leader, if I'm leading a team, leading an individual, is they present these dysfunctions. I'm going to look with curiosity at them rather than judgment. And I saw a graph. I saw a great graph, which I think I talked about with you last time, that it was just a graphic of kind of a flow chart that's on the side, and it just breaks down. So you'd have one block that goes to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 and just multiples. And then that's called curiosity, that you follow that and you're just looking through each path for what's there, what's happened. How does the backstory and the autobiography of you and your memories, how does that form who you in personality have become? And then the below part was just judgment, which, when we as humans tend to have very surface level judgments of people. We see somebody we're leading, they have an attitude, and we immediately think, just stop it. You're an idiot, or why are you being an idiot? Or why are you screwing everything up? And it's like, whoa. What if we were to think slowly about that with
Context,
curiosity?
Right? Context matters.
Context, 100%. And so when we look at personality disorders, I think it's important, again, to think biochemistry, because everything that's personality oriented is really, we're talking biochemistry, and we're talking about brain evolution, not evolution like from, the dinosaur eras, but evolution from our lifetime. And we look at things like even the love languages, which fascinates me. The love languages of acts of service, gifts, quality time, touch, and words of affirmation. You look at all those, and people then take that and think, I now have an entitlement to have that because this is what I need. And they don't stop, perhaps, to slow down to ask, where did this come from? And what is, for me, words of affirmation? The words of affirmation, for me, meet a deeper internal need that was the evolution of my biochemistry, that I feel deeply that this is what is going to satisfy the deeper anxieties that are rolling. So the anxiety is saying that if I get words of affirmation, I will survive and belong. That's ultimately what that is. So then I can now say, I don't have to have all of the externalization of these, words of affirmation or gifts or whatever. I don't have to have that. I now need to do what Murray Bowen and Family Systems taught in self-differentiation. I need to turn inward and look at that anxiety and learn how to mitigate that for myself, manage that, process that. Where's it coming from? Why is it there? What's it serving me for? What's it trying to get for me? And then from that, be able to live a more wholehearted, human flourishing kind of life. I look at that for, just basic, if you go to the DISC profile or Myers-Briggs and all of that, that's all these things are. Now, is there a genetic factor? Probably, but we don't, how would you even quantify that?
Yeah.
So when you're talking about these different biochemistry reactions and kind of how we have evolved, talk just a little bit about how that shifts in the DSM into mood disorders. So you have personality disorders and then mood disorders, and then we'll do a deeper dive into borderline.
Okay. Two things I want to make a point of, though, before we do that with what you just said. I want to validate the point that you made about our needs emerge from our wounds. It's that simple. Like our needs, whatever needs we have, they've emerged, right? Like by way of a wound that's been unresolved or unaddressed.
Yes.
Right? And that's how we're looking to find connection, find attunement, find validation, find blessing, find healthy touch. Like, but we have to be honest in reflecting on like, what are my wounds, and how do I make sense of my needs when I attune to those. The difficulty with that across the board with DSM-5 personality disorders, all 10 of them, is we're talking largely about a crippling deficit in capacity for self-awareness.
Interesting.
So like everything you just did for a couple minutes in talking, like drew on your capacity, call it observing ego, you can call it self-reflection, call it whatever you want.
Awareness.
Self-awareness, right? Like your ability to tune into yourself in that way. Right? Imagine trying to navigate life without that channel internally.
Hey, have you ever wanted to explore how your backstory is influencing your present story? Have you ever wondered why you were driven the way you were driven, or why you want the things you so deeply want, or why you might be triggered the way you're triggered? Maybe there's something in your life that keeps derailing you or exposing the fractures in your heart and soul. At Red Ink Revival, I facilitate groups of 6 to 10 men or 6 to 10 ladies in an exploration process that includes worksheets, tools for discovery, and insights into personal motivations, torments, and reactions. And it's all done online through Zoom in a short 6-week experience. Now don't worry, you won't be required to share anything you don't want to. Your story is yours to share when and where you're ready. But first, you owe it to yourself to know what that story actually is. Our alumni report having life-changing experiences and integrations in all spheres of life. They report it actually felt like they entered into a revival. They even say they now lead others like never before as they instinctively map their teammates' own story considerations. We're developing groups specific for individual classifications like senior pastors or spouses, church staff, educators, foster adoption parents, marketplace leaders, and churches at large. Go to redinkrevival.com and find the events tab to learn more. Why would someone not have that developed? Is it that they just never were given opportunity, tools, and somebody teaching them that you can be aware?
Yes, and you're already talking about like a post 4-year-old developmental period. I'm actually going to take us into some of Alan Shore, neuropsychiatrist's work, and thinking about where there's not that scaffolding neurologically. So now we're not just talking about biochemistry, we're talking about like neural structuring, like when there's not that continuity of interpersonal contact, when there's not the stability of attachment. When I cry, I don't know if I'm going to be picked up or not picked up, be it for hunger, for wetness, for loneliness, for fear, doesn't matter. If there's no continuity. There's significant, Alex Katahakis would call that like the first trauma we experience.
So you're talking really in the first year of life.
Early.
0 to 1.
And later, right? But like, yes.
Now, how much of this can be happening even in the womb? So if the baby's not just a piece of flesh.
There's plenty of research to suggest that attachment template is programmed in utero. Like, are we talking to our baby? Are we singing to our baby? Right? Like, I can't remember if I've shared this story here, but like when my second son was born via cesarean section and was naked and cold and being APGAR scored on the scale in the hospital room, I was probably standing 6 feet away and just said, "Hey, it's going to be okay, baby Graham." Like he's crying, like he was fine until he got his little shot in his leg, right? And all I said was like, "It's going to be okay, baby Graham." And like that child stopped crying. He's 2 minutes old, right? Like stopped crying, and like is like has no control over his head, but like he's flopping his head over in my general direction, even though he can't see me. He could see maybe 12 inches away. from his eyes, and after that it became gray mush.
Yeah.
But he already knew my voice.
Yeah.
It was already, or I wish I had understood this in the moment.
Yeah.
Right? Like I was just glad, like, okay, stop crying. Right? It's taken me years to really exegete the sacredness of that moment and realize, like, wow, like this bond.
Yeah.
As he's 2 minutes old, like the sound of my voice was enough to calm his pain.
Yeah.
To reduce his anxiety, right? To give him a sense of withness, of connectedness, of attunement.
Yeah.
Right? When he didn't know anything yet. Like all he knew was like, I'm not in my mom, I'm cold, not knowledge, but like his body is experiencing like, this is not the same, it's cold.
Yeah.
Now it hurts. And I'm orienting to like, where's the familiarity?
Yeah.
There's not the sound of my mother's pulse. There's not the white noise of the womb. Like now there's clanging and clattering and voices. And then all of a sudden through all that, like he hears something familiar, like, gives me goosebumps, right?
Yeah.
The poignancy of that, like absolutely that process starts in utero, like that dynamic of attachment and attunement and connection. And we see that with infants.
Which, if that part's true, then whatever anxieties, just what would be considered normal anxieties that mom is experiencing in pregnancy.
Also transmitted.
Also.
Her cortisol level, baby's cortisol level. We don't talk enough about birth trauma for infants. We don't talk enough about postpartum PTSD. We tend to mask it as postpartum depression. A lot of it is actually postpartum PTSD.
Yeah. And so what can happen is the baby, even in the womb, and then in that first year, when anxieties present, the baby has only the ability to see and hear and feel, really. So its brain is developing an adaptation to mom, an adaptation to dad, mom's relationship to dad. There is no real mapping of the cognitive. So a baby doesn't have language, a baby doesn't have rational thoughts.
Borrowing all of it.
And so, so the baby's then adapting and thinking, okay, this is what mom needs in her anxiety. So this is how I survive and belong without any conscious thinking of it. And so in that first year of life, personality is so developed not around the stereotypical concepts of what do you like and not like, what's your favorite color, what do you like words of affirmation or do you want gifts? None of that. It's all wrapped up in what does my primary caretakers need, primarily my mom, and then moving to my dad. So you're talking in that first year, and then you're going to up to 4 years.
0 to 4, that critical developmental window. Yeah, all of these
because the brain is just like multiplying in its development. See, I think that it's so interesting when we talk about personalities in that kind of way, because it brings it back to something you feels like you can put your hands around. You can get handles for. So much of what we talk about with personality feels mysterious. And then you get into these disorders. And these disorders are, even as a pastor or a leader or someone who is, has a team or leading an organization, what they are dealing with is a bunch of people that, just like themselves, have had brains that have endeavored to adapt, to fit in, to survive, to belong. Right. And so the reactivity, some people shut down, some people have water cooler conversations after the meeting. They don't say a word passively. They're very passive in the meeting, and then they talk about all the things they don't like. Or you have the individual who's high anxiety, hijacks the meeting, and whatever the agenda of that anxiety for that person is going to take the meeting in whatever direction it goes. All of that's formation from childhood, and it may actually end up being in a cluster or diagnosable as something, but even if it's not diagnosable, those features still are what you're looking at or dealing with. So,
and one of the things that fascinates me about how personality shows up ecologically, right, like in a system, is, we see it. Like I worked in domestic violence for a while when I was in grad school, just a shelter, women's shelter, and it's amazing how the different personalities, it's almost like magnets. Like that a dependent personality is almost inevitably going to be found by an antisocial personality. And It's there, right? I've seen a lot of narcissists and borderline, right? Like, so it's interesting, right? Like, and where I'm going with this is I wonder what that looks like if you have a pastoral personality that's very strong, maybe even like has features or a full disorder, like,
yeah,
what is being built around that? Who's going to stay?
Yeah, yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
who's going to stay as that church is growing and evolving and being built are the people who have resonance with whatever that style is.
Yeah.
Again, not disorder, but like just that style even.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, back to borderline personality disorder, BPD, when I think of my mom, so let me give a little history, maybe it'll help folks, is that my granddad grew up in a very impoverished condition. When he's 4 years old, somewhere in that 4-year range, his mom and dad didn't have enough money to care for him. So they sent him off to be raised by a family member. So you can immediately see the negligence from the primary caretaker and how the brain is formulating, what does this mean? What's the meaning of this? Even if there's not cognition, to be able to connect dots, the emotional part of the brain, the amygdala that comes out primarily, developed at birth, and then the other parts of the brain are just doing the best they can for helping survival. So as a 4-year-old, he's already got trauma. Well, he ends up being quite an achiever. He ends up being the president of Savings and Loan. He's done some stuff that apparently his processes are being used in a lot of banks and savings and loans today that he developed, a long time ago. He's passed now. But when he gets married, he has 3 daughters, and my mom is the middle one. And Granddad, who's one of my heroes, by the way, because I wasn't around him when all of that was childhood. My aunts and my mom were dealing with stuff. So I was entertained by it. I mean, I knew the lane, I adapted and all that, but and he loved me, and he's a hero. But we all make fun of him because he had probably OCD issues. Because I'm talking, he would take his car if he heard anything back to Cadillac, and he just wore those guys out. When my dad, so his son-in-laws, and then the other 2 son-in-laws, when they would come over to his house, he would do stuff like he would make them pull the couch out so he could vacuum the white wall vacuum where the head area. There wasn't anything on the wall, but he wanted to make sure it was vacuumed. He wanted everything perfect and aligned. So my mom grew up with a high intensity of anxiety from her dad. And her dad, who loved her dearly, he could cry on a dime. And he could go, in fact, my granddad could cuss a dog that had hiked his leg and used in the bathroom right in his yard, and he'd get a BB gun ready to shoot him out of the yard. He could go from cussing that dog to saying, Pat, wait, before you go, you got to pray, and then he'd start crying. Oh, yes, Jesus, oh, yes. And so he's this guy who my mom and her sisters struggled to figure out where they fit in with it. And there are stories of injury, of just shock and awe. My granddad at one point told my mom that he bought her this amazing convertible red car. And she's like 17. And I mean, apparently it's like what you see in pictures. I mean, my dad told me about it, and it was just an amazing opportunity. And my granddad said, if I ever catch you smoking, I'll sell that car. And, Mom went and smoked, and Granddad apparently found out about it. She comes home from school, and she's like, where's my car? He said, you don't have a car. So rather than the interpersonal teaching, instruction, development, you have the extremes. You have an extreme of, I have anxiety, you smoked, I'm going to make an explosive moment here, And so that injures mom, but you then pull about 100 of those and aggregate,
right, thread
and
them
you
together, yeah.
and you blow this whole picture and profile up. So my mom, she actually would be diagnosable from the things I've read about those clusters and markers, and as I look at those, my mom would be somebody that when she was close to Jesus, it was calmer. But when she would have, like in her later years, it was just all one way or the other. I hate, I can't stand. And it's interesting because it's like she had so blown her neurochemistry and neurocircuit connectors that it's like what would make her feel alive is being as angry and grit teeth and blow up. And then she would be on the other extreme, tender, generous. And I grew up around that. That was there from childhood. It's just that it wasn't as extreme as what it became. And she was so intolerant of being present in a moment. And anything I would ever talk to her about, I remember one time saying to her, Mom, I don't like it that we're distant. I don't like the fact that we're not close, and I would love to, just reconnect and repair wherever we can and need to. And of course, if I'm honest, I didn't have anything I felt like I needed to repair, but I'm throwing everything on the table. And she immediately goes into a victim's mindset and begins telling me how she hates that we're distant as well. And I began to say, well, what do you need? I don't know. I began to say, what can we do? Can we create a plan so that we're calling or talking? No, I don't know. And I left that conversation just feeling so exhausted and empty. And so my mom, like as an example, when my grandmother, her mom, when she passed, they lived down in northwest Arkansas, Eureka Springs area. And we had an ice storm. I was living here in Kansas City, had an ice storm. And my granddad called me and said, you're not coming, are you, to the funeral? And I said, well, I was going to. He said, no, don't do it. I don't want 2 funerals. I don't, because it's ice, all that. I don't know. And I said, well, Granddad, I can't not come. He said, no, I don't want you coming. He said, I know you love us, but I don't want to put you in danger. My mom tells everybody at the funeral that I always get out of stuff. Is that kind of just extreme? She's trying to figure out what to do with rejection, betrayal. Does she belong and survive? And so as a pastor, I am not diagnosable. I do have awareness of my issues. I didn't always know what they were, but as a pastor, when people leave our church, when I pastored a church, I would have an intensification from mirror neurons and mapping and et cetera, and I would feel it so deep. It was so tunnel vision. I couldn't see beyond that tunnel that somebody's not just leaving the church. They are saying, I hate you. That's what I would hear. I hate you. And I would think, I gave my life for you, and you hate me? And it doesn't make cognitive sense. It's not conscious, it's just that I'm overwhelmed. My neurosystem, and when that
survival mode, right? Like
in that survival mode,
just like your mom got activated into her survival mode.
Yes.
And to go back to that, I would wonder how much of the pressure of even owning that car, right? Like if there was a trade between like I can have this nice possession or my autonomy, like she chose her autonomy in some ways because the car awakened a lot of anxiety. She was probably just, A, she did it on purpose, I would guess, and B, she's just trying to escape the intensity of anxiety that came with the gift.
That's a profound thought. Well, talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about borderline personality disorder. Again, earlier you were showing some of the features, but let's go back into those features and let's just see where it takes us.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of them, kind of that black or white thinking, all or nothing thinking tends to permeate the imaginations of those who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Kind of a my way or the highway, but it's really just a rigid style of experiencing self and experiencing the world. The hard part of that, again, like I can't emphasize enough the significance of not having the capacity for self-reflection or self-awareness. Because in that space, like, we're never the problem.
Yeah.
It's always happening around me. We call it externalization, right?
Yeah.
Like, everything's a problem. And externalization means, like, I can't go into myself and calm or soothe or cope, back to Alan Shore, because I don't have a healthy internal working model of my caregivers.
Yeah.
It's like, I can't go into, I know I'm loved, I know I'm cared for, here's where that happened.
Yeah.
If I don't have any capacity for self-reflection. So I have to move to things like sexual acting out, gambling, drugs, alcohol. With borderline personality disorder, an interesting kind of sub-feature of that is cutting or self-injurious behavior.
Yeah.
So trying to feel something. There's a sense of emptiness that really permeates borderline personality disorder. A desire to feel, so a desire to kind of break through the numbness that's there. So.
Wow.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I think, so there's all those. I don't want to short circuit that conversation, but to kind of get back to where you were with thinking about on the pastoral side.
Yeah.
Right. What does it look like to sit with and care for someone where you're seeing all this and it activates our bodies?
Yeah.
Like to sit with someone where there's true characterological dysfunction, a true diagnosable personality disorder. We feel it.
Yeah.
We leave conversations exhausted. I can tell you as a therapist, in my body.
Yeah.
Like even talking about it a bit today, right? Like my body is going back to some of the many sessions I've had with antisocial personalities or obsessive compulsive personalities or borderline personalities, where there's just an exponentially higher cost energy-wise to sitting in that space. Typically, for me, for most students that I've had over the years, right? Like your core just feels it. You know, we get into polyvagal theory, but like I feel it.
Like
it's like
nausea.
there's a threat here. There's a tension. Yeah, there's a nausea. There's a tension, an unsettledness.
Yeah.
And it's like we have to honor the wisdom of our bodies. And again, not through the lens of judgment. It's just another point of information to say, okay,
Absolutely.
like there's something here that my mind is engaging this person as though they have all of their faculties and have all of the capacities, self-reflection, self-awareness, empathy, attunement, et cetera. But my body is picking up on something. And I've got to honor the reality of that. And I'm certain that pastors who are listening could probably think back through the Rolodex of experiences they've had where there's been blow-ups, there's been accusations, there's been significant rupture in their churches. And there's likely, in some of those stories at least, I would say probably a good majority of those stories, there's someone who the best way to make sense of the context is you have a disordered personality where the exclusivity of whatever that trait is just like driving a bulldozer through the building project.
Yes.
Right? Like bulldozers are necessary, like to move the dirt, but like when we're bulldozing the houses that are being built, like there's a problem.
Yeah.
But without that self-reflection, right, the bulldozer never realizes like that they're destroying the good things. Like they just think they're moving dirt.
Yeah. How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you will do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details. I think about my mom, and I think, what would have happened in her life? And gosh, I feel emotion come up. What would have happened in her life if she could have had somebody to hold her heart and walk her through her trauma and begin to develop awareness of all that's happening in her and why it's happening in her? I wonder if my mom could have had a happy life, and I believe she would have. I'm confident she would have. So Red Ink Revival is an example. You know, I get to be at the driver's seat of it, and one of the passions, the horsepower that's behind it, is my story and my family's story. That if the next person who's like my mom could be helped, I'd give everything I have to make that happen. What do you do with someone? So let's kind of imagine that we are the leader of an organization, we're pastoring, we're leading a family even. We are in an environment where we can catalyze some level of influence and change. What do we do with someone who has perhaps even diagnosable markers of borderline personality disorder? I'm guessing we start with awareness.
Actually start with boundaries.
Start with boundaries. So talk about that. Kind of lead us through.
Yeah, so I think interpersonally, right, like the notion of boundaries, it's not about controlling other people's behavior.
Yeah.
Right, it's about establishing clear parameters for how we're going to navigate the interpersonal process. Yeah. I think that even in a psychotherapeutic environment, that's where we start.
Yeah.
Right, like, so borderline personality disorder. A lot of fear of abandonment, a lot of projective identification shows up, a lot of transference.
Wait. A lot of projective identification.
Yeah. So a lot of like, I am blaming someone else for the things that I'm doing.
Yes.
Right, like,
So
or you can just
externalizing everything.
turn on any like political news and you'll see it play out pretty well. Right, we're blaming other people for the things that we ourselves are guilty of doing.
Yeah.
So a lot of overt boundary intrusions in that space. A lot of asking about family, right? Like they want to get into your life. A lot of calling at inappropriate hours, right? Like again, that fear of rejection. Am I going to be good enough as a client? Yeah. Like what hooks can I get in you? Yeah. Not maliciously, not purposefully, but like the more hooks I have in you, the more I can do my part to guarantee that you're not going to abandon me, like refer me. Yeah. But it's boundaries. Like I'm not going to take that phone call.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you're suicidal, here's the number. Like we have a plan for this.
Yeah.
Like you don't need to. It's inappropriate actually to ask about my family, my wife, my kids. Right? Like nobody does that except for.
Yeah.
Folks who are struggling with characterological disturbances. Right? Again, it's a survival style. Like if I can endear myself, if I can get myself close to you, well, like therapy is really first and foremost, before it's about fostering self-awareness, it's about establishing boundaries.
Yeah. Which requires a precursor or a component of boundaries has to begin with self-differentiation.
100%.
Which is that I am individuated, I can stay connected, individuated and connected, and I am now looking inward to how this person is triggering my anxiety. And then I'm making me responsible for my anxiety rather than blaming them for my experience. Right. And from that, you build those boundaries. Now, when we want to lean into, though, someone who has these features, how do we help them move towards recovery and growth?
Yeah. So that's where something like dialectical behavior therapy, it's Marsha Linehan's work up in the Pacific Northwest. She's dedicated her career to growing a model, a paradigm, an intervention, if you will, a whole therapy around how do we help establish boundaries and grow intra-psychic awareness, like self-awareness, and interpersonal functioning. Yeah. So a lot of it has to do with like emotional regulation. But again, if I don't know what emotion I'm having, I'm not going to use tools.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So her whole approach, her whole model is STOP, Dearman, like there's all these acronyms and mnemonic devices that she uses to help folks who don't have a lot of self-awareness begin to onboard and live in that space. Interestingly, DBT should include a group component, like done well. Why? Because we know, like, you mentioned mirror neurons, right? We learn differently in a social milieu.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we learn well by listening and hearing and seeing and experiencing, and group formats just enhance the functionality of any intervention. So for her, there's the individual work, but like always, it's metabolized differently in the context of a group therapeutic environment. So again, it's the essentials, right? Establishing boundaries, fostering self-awareness, developing skills, emotional regulation skills, communication skills, etc. But for borderline personality disorder, I would say the best approach would be to work with a DBT trained therapist and to have that group dynamic.
Group experience. And just keying off the group experience, I just am fascinated by the way we are designed. So, as an example, the extreme kind of examination would be a husband and wife, because that's the most intense kind of relationship. But when a man is with his wife, just the scent of her releases oxytocin. Just her pheromones, just the scent of her releases oxytocin. Now, the reason that's important is oxytocin is a destroying factor to cortisol. It unwinds it. And cortisol is the stress and anxiety biochemical. So when you are in a group setting and you're able to see each other and you're able to be in the room and you're able to tell your story, you are telling your story and there's cortisol coming up. And the way that your brain mapped out your trauma story and pain story, now then it's coming up. But because I have another human there that is empathetically and compassionately, so the compassion is a huge part of that, is able to look back at me, the oxytocin inside of me, as I've told my story, is now then reframing that story now where it's taking all of that cortisol neural pathway and saying, wait, I'm going to now then work in unwinding that for you so that now when you think of these memories, they're not going to be as controlling of you as they were before.
Yeah, and even something like in the literature, neuro literature the other day, looking at how facial responses actually begin to mediate cortisol production. So like when we're alone, right? Like we've all had this experience. Like our stories just get amped up and amped up and amped up in our mind. And in the context of group, right? Like if you have people who are compassionately and attentively listening, like as you look around the room, right? Like you're already getting this cue to downregulate cortisol production because you have people here that apparently care. Right, and then you've got this connective dynamic with,
which is when I think of all of what you and I just talked about, the facial, and again, this is unconscious. This is our autonomic nervous system is highly engaging of what is presented in relationship. So during COVID and lockdowns and masks and what we're doing to our kids, all of that matters, even in church life.
Absolutely.
Not going to church or watching online doesn't do to the brain what gathering together does to the brain. And so if it, and now I'm taken from J.P. Moreland and Stan Wallace, if it does it to the brain, it does it to the soul. You cannot talk the brain without talking the immaterial soul. Because the immaterial soul is the energy and it gets forged. You can behaviorally and in your imagination, fantasy world, and etc., you can forge what's happening in your soul. And your soul can forge what's happening down into your biological body. So it's so important that we go to church. It's so important that we have community. And in someone who's struggling with even their awareness, I think it's so powerful to be in a group where everyone together is metabolizing that.
I think it gets back to your kind of schematic you're talking about. where judgment needs to be the last thing, and not judgment like condemnation, but judgment like, what do we do now, right? Like, so it's really more discernment than true judgment.
Yeah.
Because in spaces where like we see a lot of rigidity, criticism at the communal level, right? Like we see a lot more pathology, quite frankly, not just personality disorders, but any type of mental illness is going to be there. Why? Because, right, like if what we see or anticipate is condemnation and judgment and backbiting and like we hide. And then shame, probably the primary emotional catalyst for unwellness. Like shame has us hidden, has us living in our deficiencies, has us living compartmentalized, disintegrated lives. So I mean, it's imperative, like A, not just to not give up meeting together, irrespective of what the government might think, but B, how we do that qualitatively matters.
Yes, qualitatively,
Like how we live out the essence of the body of Christ in community.
Yeah.
We can disagree with people.
Right.
Like I can think you have smoked too much dope with what you've posted on social media, because it's like cuckoo land.
Yeah.
And when I see you at church, like I can still have, if nothing else, like a warm, neutral countenance. Like I don't have to smile and give you a hug, like, oh, like good.
Yeah.
Like I might not feel that, but I can at least be there in a warm, empathic, like I can acknowledge you, I can say good morning, I can say hello. Like there's a way, because when we don't do that, like anybody who's come from a neglectful environment, like all that stuff gets activated, and then the worst of them comes out. They came looking for something different, and then the style that the church embodies, maybe it's just one or two people embody, like can be enough to activate for them, and then they're living out of the worst parts, that living out of their wounds, rather than living out of the hope that they're coming to church to experience, which is like, I don't want it to always be this way. I don't want to be stuck in the exclusivity of this place where I'm stuck.
Pastors, did you know that upwards of 70% of the men in your congregation are regularly accessing pornography, stuck in shame, torn in conflict, and therefore immobilized for zealous ministry? That's 7 out of 10. The problem is not going to go away. What are you doing to lead your men into wholeness? Porn and sex addiction is characterized by undesirable compulsive behaviors that feature incongruence with personal values, and it interferes with normal living, causing stress on their relationships with God, family, friends, loved ones, and possibly even their own work environment. Well, where do you send men to recover and become both whole and integrated? Red Ink Recovery offers a unique program exclusive to porn and sex-related addictions. Our clinical professionals, our psychologists and therapists, have created a transformative treatment process that collects the dots, connects the dots, and corrects the dots that have driven the addictions. Our approach heals the heart, restores the soul, and rebuilds the neuroplasticity of the brain. Our clients find their lives have been wildly marked by Christ as they are given a path for trust being rebuilt. And they are resourced for far greater relationships and intimacy than they have ever known before. All of our professional teammates are experts in the field of sexual addiction. They are all trained by Dr. Patrick Carnes and certified by the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Dr. Carnes is known as the father and curator of modern sexual addiction recovery as a movement. Pastors, we encourage you to recommend your men who struggle to come to one of our intensives. If you are just a simple man that struggles, maybe you're new to the faith or you don't even know what you believe about Christ, be encouraged to join us. We will honor your journey and give you the tools to live in wholeness. To find out more about our porn and sex addiction intensives and when the next one is, go to redinkrevival.com.
And I see people, and I know even for me in my earlier years, I can go back and think, okay, so if I'm individuated and I have a strong opinion that is different than your overwhelming strong opinion, I would in that space think, well, if I'm smiling and loving you and endeavoring to be connected, it feels like it's hypocrisy. It feels like I'm putting a front on. And yet, what helps me today and just completely settles it is self-differentiation requires of me to be individuated, have my unique self, and to stay connected. So for me, because of these features and borderline that I mirrored from mom, and again, I'm not diagnosable, but I do have some markers. I do fit somewhere in that spectrum, that when somebody is attacking me, I always move towards, once that happens, once betrayal happens, my instinct is to move to individuation, to the point of detachment. Where a healthy, emotionally healthy person says, no, I'm going to stay individuated and I'll stay connected with healthy boundaries. I'm not going to let you run ripshod over me. I'm not going to let you hurt me. But the reason I'm not going to let you hurt me is because I want to stay connected. Now, I may not be able to stay connected in face-to-face human spaces. I may not be able to spend time with you because your toxicity is creating for me such, backwards emotions that I find that I don't like you and I don't want to be around you.
Yeah, and you might need to step away so that you can downregulate, so that you can rejoin.
Yes.
Right? Like, just because you step away or take a step back, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right, but it's about, do I rejoin? Like, how do I come back to this space once I've...
Such a game changer.
Yeah, resourced myself.
Such a game changer.
Yeah, and it's hard. Yeah. Right, I can tell you, on the therapeutic side, like, it's challenging to live in therapeutic relationship with someone who's presenting with personality disorder. Like, it's demanding work. And I've got tools for it. Like, I've got training and expertise and assessment, and like I can get a really good handle on this, and it's challenging. Like, on the pastoral side, we're just loving well and loving without boundaries, right?
Right.
Which I think sometimes gets pastors in trouble.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Like, you're unknowingly, in your care for people in your church, like, you're unknowingly entering into spaces that are going to leave you, like, villainized, leave you the bad guy, leave you accidentally intruding. You're going to get close to them because you greeted them warmly on a Sunday morning, and then the next day you went to another family and you have no idea that you awakened the full ire of someone because you didn't say hello.
Right.
Like, you can't do that for every person every Sunday.
Right.
But if that becomes the expectation because of someone's story, like, I promise you, like, if there's enough pastors listening, somebody's already, like, their body is going crazy because they remember that time early in their pastorate where they didn't say hello to somebody, and boy, like, they got it, and they were told, and that wound, right? Like, maybe now they overfunction pastorally because of the intensity of that wound.
See, it's amazing. I think about the fusion, which is when we own the emotional state of whoever we're around. Yeah. So as a pastor, we tend to do that. And for somebody like me who already has tendencies towards borderline personality disorder, and again, I'm not diagnosable, but I have those features. It's a part of my brain's networking. Whenever I would see somebody that I loved, I would begin to invest in them. And over time, as I'm investing in them, my dreams come alive for how, when we are 80 years old together, we'll be sitting on a porch telling about all the giants that we killed, in the name of Jehovah and Jesus. And so, all of that happens, and then they somewhere down the line get unsettled, and you don't know why. Their serving begins to drop off, then their giving begins to drop off, and the handwriting's on the wall. They're on their way out, and you counted them as one of your closest friends at the church, and then they leave. And when all of that comes together, you rather than turn towards your dream and grieve the loss of your dream, because that's what you're grieving. Be able to tolerate the grief of that loss. That part of the dream is not going to happen. Grieve it, feel it, allow it, turn towards it. And then what we have to do is say, how much fusion did I have with those people? Right. Where I'm now questioning my own sense of self and identity. And I'm at risk of losing everything if I'm wrong. And here's what good identity says. Good identity says, I will live in truth, which means reality is I will commit to believing something, even if that thing is wrong, because when I commit to what I believe, an opinion or a personality feature I have, if I commit, this is who I am right now, when I commit to this, it then gives me so much more room to grow than if I'm just always dodging that I don't want to commit to anything lest I be mocked and exploited like memes. And what all social media is teaching all of Americans and the world today that if you say anything stupid, even if you don't say something stupid, but if they capture a picture of you that they can exploit and make you look stupid. So all of us are like, don't commit to anything, don't believe anything, don't have an opinion on anything. And so as pastors, when we have these moments, we've got to think, how much fusion did I enter into in these relationships where I own the emotions of everybody? And so I don't deal with a staff member that needs to be taught and corrected. Corrected as in they're not going to perform well and their own wounds are causing them to spin in a way that's not healthy for the whole organization. But I'm sacrificing the organization because I don't know if I say something to them, how are they going to respond? So I've fused with them. Now I'm taking responsibility for what their potential, how I am anticipating their reaction. And so again, and I did this as a pastor over years, I became a very unhealthy individual because I wasn't individuated. I was so fused and enmeshed that I'm bouncing around like a pinball in a pinball machine. And so again, I think it's critical that we dig down in our stories.
Yeah, and I think I would add language there. I think you're right. And I would add some language that sometimes the starting point for that is to courageously challenge the story in our head.
I love it.
Like, what's the story in my head? They're leaving because, and maybe they've left poorly.
Yeah.
Right? Like maybe the story in your head is already accurate because of how they left. I think COVID has brought unprecedented transition within churches. Right? So there's a lot of potential for wounding.
Yeah.
In spaces where people are consolidating life, they're choosing to not travel as far, maybe they're prioritizing parts of their life differently. And not every church can offer everything to every person.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is really critical about recognizing, am I fusing and how much of my pain is a reflection of my poor boundaries as a pastor?
Yeah.
And if I'm experiencing undue pain, it's one thing if somebody makes a false accusation, plasters it all over social media, it's on the news, all of it's a lie.
Right.
There's grievance there.
Right.
It's another thing, like you're saying though, of recognizing, maybe my own unwellness led me to a place of feeling deep emotion when it is appropriate for that person.
Yeah.
To make a transition.
Yeah. Right.
So being able to challenge, what's the story in my head? And how do I back away from the emotional fusion, the emotional intensity that's been awakened here, and really allow my logic, my reason to parse through. Under what conditions does that decision make sense?
Yeah.
Right, and to help de-escalate that emotional intensification. And then we can more objectively look at, this hurts because, right? It hurts because that's sad to see that family go.
Yeah.
It hurts more when we have an undue level of investment in those people staying so that I'm okay as a pastor.
That is powerful. And that's where I often would live. And it was just demoralizing.
Let me break in one more time and tell you about RedInkRevival.com. That is REDINK Revival.com. I want to encourage you to go there and sign up for our blog e-newsletter. Every month it will hit your inbox with a blog post and new special events that will ink your soul with revival.
And then you would quote scripture and nothing, like the joy of the Lord is my strength, peace of God passes understanding, keeps the guards of my heart. And that's great. If I say that's great, I don't want to minimize its power, but if you're not going to be self-differentiated, that's going to work for you for 5 minutes. Yeah. And then you're going to return right back to your chaos.
You can quote all the scripture you want, but if you're not working in harmony with God's design, which would be to metabolize the sadness and the grief and the pain of somebody transitioning out of the church, right? I don't know what to tell you. I trust completely in the word of the Lord, and His word tells us about how we're made. The Psalms and Proverbs are full of wisdom for how to go about living well, to include pouring out and expressing our emotions to Him, so that there's space for the seed of the word to take root in our hearts and in our minds.
So good. Well, it's another great episode. Borderline personality disorder. Do you have any resources that somebody could go and read, somebody could look at? I know the book I read, I can't think of the author, but it's called Stop Walking on Eggshells.
Yeah, that's kind of the hallmark one. Marsha Linehan is probably the penultimate kind of researcher and psychologist in this, has the best resources available. We can put some on the website if it would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And what those will do is not just help frame up the experiences and put a name to it, but it'll also give you tools for yourself, if you are a family member or a relationship friend of that person, to be able to know how to best manage that. And of course, that goes into our leadership and in every environment we're in. So thanks, man.
Yep, absolutely. Good to be with you.